On a sunny morning in Manhattan, a 14-year-old black boy is being yelled at by a white woman. But then the woman apologizes to him for her actions. Why is that? Watch H2 Black Thread for a story of heroism, betrayal, and the power to rise above it all. Don't forget to leave a comment with your thoughts and subscribe to our channel to stay updated with our latest videos. Because the truth deserves to be told. Let's get started. It was a crisp morning in Manhattan, the type of day where the sun shone brightly but the air still held a slight chill, a reminder that the seasons were changing. Eliza Montgomery, 30 years old and heavily pregnant, was enjoying her daily walk down the bustling streets of the city. The streets were filled with the usual noise of honking horns, the hum of conversation, and the rhythmic footsteps of hurried New Yorkers. But Eliza, in her own little bubble, took comfort in the routine of it all, savoring the quiet moments between her busy life as the wife of David Montgomery, a well-known billionaire. Eliza had always cherished these walks. They were her way of escaping from the tension that seemed to hang over her lavish life. Though married to one of the wealthiest men in the world, Eliza felt disconnected from the luxury surrounding her. She had always longed for a simpler life, one where she could just be herself, not defined by her husband's money or status. The fresh air and movement were a welcome break from the pressures of being constantly in the public eye. As she strolled along the sidewalk, the city seemed to be going about its usual chaos. The distant sound of sirens, the crowd milling around, and the constant flow of traffic, it was all part of the routine. Eliza's hand rested gently on her growing belly, feeling the soft movements of her unborn child. She smiled to herself, thinking of how much her life was about to change with the arrival of her baby. Then, suddenly, the peaceful calm was shattered by the blaring of a car horn. A split second of confusion filled the air as Eliza turned, her eyes wide with fear. In front of her, a massive truck was speeding toward her, the driver clearly unable to slow down in time. The vehicle was out of control, veering toward her in a reckless manner, and there was no way she could escape its path. Time seemed to slow. Eliza's heart pounded in her chest, her body frozen in place as the truck continued its course. Her instincts screamed at her to move, to run, but the fear was paralyzing. Her mind raced with thoughts of her unborn child. She couldn't die here. She couldn't let her baby be taken away from her. Just as the truck was about to reach her, a blur of motion cut through the air. A figure appeared out of nowhere, darting from the side, and before Eliza could even process what was happening, a young boy had tackled her, sending her flying out of the truck's path. She crashed into the sidewalk, a moment of impact, and then the world seemed to return to its usual speed. The truck screeched to a halt, its tires skidding across the asphalt, narrowly missing Eliza. The driver, a middle-aged man in a suit, swerved the wheel hard, trying to regain control, and the truck slammed into the curb, its front end crumpling against the concrete. A loud bang echoed in the air, and the crowd around them quickly sprang into action, their shouts filling the chaotic moment. Eliza's breath came in ragged gasps as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. Her hands instinctively moved to her belly, checking to make sure everything was okay. She could feel her heart racing, but at least she was alive. She turned to look at the person who had saved her. The boy, no older than 14, was sprawled on the ground a few feet away. He was thin, his clothes ragged, and his face twisted in pain. Blood trickled from a cut on his forehead, and one of his legs was scraped badly. Yet, despite his injuries, he was quickly trying to get to his feet, his eyes scanning the crowd, his posture tense as if he didn't want to be noticed. Eliza felt a surge of gratitude wash over her, but it was quickly replaced by anger as she heard the voices around them. The crowd of onlookers had gathered in a tight circle, some pointing, others whispering. Eliza expected them to be applauding the boy's bravery, but instead their words cut through her like a knife. "Typical," one of the women muttered, her voice dripping with disdain. "Another black kid trying to play the hero for attention." "Disgusting," another man sneered. "Shouldn't be out here at all, probably looking for handouts." Eliza's mouth dropped open in disbelief. The boy had just saved her life, and yet they were condemning him. Her heart ached as she saw the look of embarrassment and resignation on his face. He didn't deserve this. Nobody deserved this kind of cruelty. "Hey, are you okay?" Eliza called out, pushing herself to her feet. She walked over to the boy, whose eyes were still glued to the ground, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Without thinking, she knelt beside him, gently taking his hand in hers. His skin was rough, his fingers trembling slightly as he tried to pull away. But Eliza held on firmly, looking into his eyes. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but filled with genuine gratitude. "If it weren't for you, my baby and I would be gone right now." The boy's eyes widened slightly, surprised by her sincerity. For a moment, there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something that resembled hope. Hope that someone, just one person, could see beyond his skin color and see him for who he truly was. I didn't mean to get all this attention," he mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. I just saw you and I had to do something." "I'm so glad you did," Eliza said, her voice filled with emotion. "You saved us both." The boy glanced around as if sensing the judgment from the crowd. He tried to stand up, wincing as his scraped leg protested, but Eliza quickly helped him up. She was still holding his hand, and this time she didn't let go. "I can't just thank you and walk away," she said firmly, looking up at him. "You deserve more than that. Please come with me. Let me give you a proper meal. I owe you that much." Tyler hesitated. His face was filled with uncertainty, but Eliza could see that there was something in him that wanted to trust her. He looked at her hand, still holding his, and then back to her face. She could see the faintest trace of a smile forming at the corner of his lips. "Okay," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the noise of the crowd. "I'll come." And so, with a small but significant step, Eliza invited Tyler into her life, a life that was about to change in ways she could never have anticipated. As they walked away from the scene together, Eliza couldn't help but feel that this was the beginning of something far more complicated than just a simple thank you dinner. It was the start of an unexpected connection between two people from very different worlds, a connection that would lead them down a path filled with challenges, revelations, and, ultimately, the fight for justice. The atmosphere inside Eliza's apartment was warm, almost serene, in stark contrast to the chaos of the outside world. The grandiose design of the space, with its polished marble floors and walls adorned with paintings from renowned artists, could have easily felt cold and intimidating. Yet, there was something inviting about the room tonight. Perhaps it was the smell of the homemade pasta that Eliza had prepared, or perhaps it was the presence of the young boy sitting across from her, his head down as he picked at his plate. Tyler was quiet, his eyes scanning the room as if trying to absorb every detail of the life he had just stepped into. Eliza had asked him to join her for a meal as a simple gesture of thanks. But as they sat at her gleaming dinner table, the space between them seemed to grow wider with every passing minute. Eliza had always been surrounded by luxury and comfort, yet she realized that none of that had ever truly brought her any sense of fulfillment. Tonight, for the first time in a long while, she felt genuinely alive, and Tyler's presence, despite his quiet demeanor, felt like the beginning of something profound. She watched as Tyler picked up his fork, his hands shaking ever so slightly. It was as if the very act of sitting at a table like this was alien to him, and in a way it was. Tyler had grown up in a world where survival, not indulgence, was the priority. "Tyler," Eliza began, breaking the silence, her voice soft yet sincere, "I want you to know how much I appreciate what you did today. I don't know if I can ever truly repay you, but please know that I'm deeply grateful." Tyler shrugged, his gaze focused on the plate in front of him. "It was nothing," he muttered, his voice almost inaudible. "I just did what anyone would have done." Eliza studied him carefully, noticing the way his shoulders hunched and how his eyes never met hers. There was a kind of wariness in him, a barrier that she couldn't quite understand. This wasn't just the typical shyness she had seen in young boys. It was something deeper, something that had been shaped by years of hardship and struggle. "Tyler," she pressed gently, "I want you to know you're not just a hero for today. You're someone who matters. You matter." At her words, Tyler shifted in his seat, his eyes briefly lifting to meet hers before he quickly looked away again, a faint blush coloring his cheeks. He seemed unsure of how to process her kindness, almost as though he had never been treated with such understanding. There was a long pause before he finally spoke, his voice low and hesitant. "You don't know what it's like," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "Living in a place where nothing works out. My family, we're just trying to survive. Every day feels like a fight." Eliza's heart tightened as she listened to the pain in his voice. She set her fork down, her full attention on him. "I want to understand," she said earnestly. "Please tell me about it. Tell me what you and your family are going through." For a moment, Tyler was quiet, looking down at the food on his plate as if it held the answers to all his problems. But after a deep breath, he began to speak, his voice gaining strength as he shared the story of his life. "My mom, she's a single parent. She works 2 jobs, but it's never enough. Sometimes we can't even pay the rent and the landlord is threatening to kick us out. And my dad, I don't even know where he is. He left when I was just a kid. I barely remember him." Tyler paused, the bitterness in his tone becoming more apparent. "We live in a part of the city that nobody cares about. It's a neighborhood that nobody gives a second thought to. The only thing people care about is how they can make money off the land we live on." Eliza listened intently, her chest tightening as Tyler spoke. She could hear the frustration and hopelessness in his voice, the weight of his reality that seemed to crush him from all sides. It was a far cry from the polished life she knew, the life of privilege and ease she had grown accustomed to. "And now," Tyler continued, his voice hardening, "there's this big development project. They're tearing down our neighborhood, the whole block. They say it's for a better future, but all it's doing is pushing people like us out. We'll have nowhere to go." Eliza's stomach twisted as she heard the anger in his words. She knew this kind of thing happened in cities all over the country. The rich, the powerful, sweeping into low-income areas to build their gleaming towers and luxury condos, erasing entire communities in the process. But hearing it from Tyler, hearing it from someone she now considered a friend, brought the issue into a painful new light. "Who's backing this project?" she asked, her voice trembling with curiosity and concern. Tyler scoffed as if the answer was painfully obvious. "You wouldn't believe it. The guy behind it all, it's David Montgomery." Eliza froze, her hand tightening around her glass of water as the name hit her like a cold wave. David Montgomery, her husband, the billionaire real estate mogul who had always been so passionate about his projects, his visions for a better city. She had known about the development project, of course. It had been all over the news and social media. But she had never connected the dots. She had never realized that it was David's company that was responsible for tearing down Tyler's neighborhood. The realization hit her hard. Her husband, the man she had trusted and loved, was part of the very system that was destroying people's lives, the very system that was hurting Tyler and his family. Eliza felt a deep, unsettling conflict swirl within her. The life she had built with David, the wealth and the privilege, suddenly felt like an insurmountable barrier between her and the people who needed help the most. She looked across the table at Tyler, his eyes watching her intently, waiting for her response. He didn't know what she knew, didn't understand the connection that had just shattered her world. Eliza swallowed hard, trying to steady her breath. "I had no idea," she said quietly, the weight of her words sinking in. "I didn't know it was David's project." Tyler nodded, his expression hardening. "Yeah, well, it's not just the buildings they're destroying. It's the lives of everyone who lives there." Eliza stood up, her chair scraping against the floor as she walked to the window. The city stretched out before her, a world of glass and steel that seemed so far removed from the pain and suffering Tyler had just described. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the cool breeze from the open window wash over her face. This was her reality now. The world she had once been so comfortable in was now the very thing that was causing harm. She couldn't just sit back and do nothing, not when she knew the truth. "I'm going to talk to David," Eliza said, her voice resolute. "I'm going to tell him that this project has to stop. I'll make him listen. I won't let this go on any longer." Tyler's eyes widened in surprise. "You would do that?" "I have to," Eliza replied, her determination growing stronger. "No one should have to live like this, and I won't let my husband's company tear apart people's lives just for a profit." As Eliza turned away from the window, she felt a newfound sense of purpose surge through her. She was no longer just the wife of a billionaire. She was a woman who had witnessed the pain and suffering of those less fortunate, and she wasn't going to let that suffering continue, not if she had the power to stop it. Her decision was made. The conversation with David would not be easy, but it was one she had to have. For Tyler, for his family, and for the countless others who were being silenced and forgotten in the name of progress. This was only the beginning. Eliza's heart raced with anticipation as she stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the collar of her blouse and smoothing out the wrinkles of her skirt. The house was quiet, save for the distant hum of the city outside, but Eliza knew that today was going to be anything but quiet. She had made her decision, and now she had to face the man she had been married to for nearly a decade. David Montgomery, her husband, the billionaire mogul whose influence and wealth seemed unstoppable. But for the first time in their marriage, Eliza was about to challenge him. She had already prepared herself for what was to come. The conversation would not be easy, especially given the nature of David's work and the projects he was involved in. His pride, his ego, and his relentless drive to build and expand were all things that Eliza had admired when they first met. They had been drawn to each other by their shared ambition and vision for the future. But today, Eliza saw things through a different lens. The world she had been a part of, the world David had built, was a world that destroyed lives. Tyler's life and the lives of others like him had made her realize that something had to change. Eliza walked down the grand staircase of their mansion, the soft rhythm of her heels echoing in the marble hallway. She could already hear David's voice from the study, his deep baritone filled with authority as he discussed business with one of his associates. She had to act quickly, before the day slipped away, and before her resolve wavered. As she entered the study, David looked up from his papers, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. He was sitting behind his massive mahogany desk, a desk that had witnessed countless business deals, negotiations, and victories. Eliza, standing in front of him, was no longer the same woman he had married. She had changed, and she knew that her decision today would have a lasting impact on their lives. "Eliza," David said, his tone warm, "what brings you here today? I wasn't expecting you." "I need to talk to you," Eliza said, her voice steady but filled with urgency. "It's about the development project, the one in the neighborhood where Tyler lives." David frowned slightly, setting down the papers he had been looking at. He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. "What about it?" "I want you to stop it," Eliza said, her words cutting through the air like a knife. "I want you to cancel the project." There was a moment of silence, a brief pause where Eliza could see the flicker of surprise in David's eyes. It was quickly replaced by a mix of confusion and concern. He sat up straighter in his chair, as though trying to gauge her seriousness. "Eliza, you know how important this project is to me," David replied, his voice calm but with an edge of defensiveness. "It's a chance to revitalize the city, to bring in more jobs, to create more opportunities for growth. You can't expect me to just cancel it on a whim." Eliza took a deep breath, walking closer to his desk. "It's not a whim, David. It's about the people whose lives are being destroyed by it. Tyler's family, the people who live in that neighborhood, they're being pushed out, they're losing everything. You've seen the poverty, the crime, the neglect. This project isn't helping them, it's taking everything from them." David's expression hardened, his eyes narrowing. "I don't understand," he said, his voice cold. "Why does it matter to you so much? This is business, Eliza. You know how things work. Progress is progress." "This isn't progress, David. This is destruction," Eliza retorted, her voice rising with emotion. "You don't understand because you've never had to live in that world. You've never had to worry about your home being torn down, about your family being displaced. You don't see the human cost of these decisions." David leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. "So, what do you want me to do, Eliza? Give up everything I've worked for just because some people in a poor neighborhood are being inconvenienced?" "They're not just being inconvenienced, David. They're being destroyed," Eliza shot back. "I can't just stand by and let this happen. I'm asking you as my husband to do the right thing, stop the project, help them. Help Tyler and his family." For a moment David said nothing. He looked at Eliza, his face a mixture of frustration, disbelief, and something else, something deeper, something that Eliza couldn't quite place. Finally he spoke, his voice low and controlled. "Fine," he said. "I'll stop the project, but don't expect me to be happy about it." Eliza's heart skipped a beat. She had expected resistance, but she hadn't expected this kind of reluctant compliance. She nodded, her expression firm but filled with relief. "Thank you, David," she said softly. "I promise you, this is the right thing to do." A few days later, Tyler's family moved into the Montgomery mansion. It had all happened so quickly that Eliza hadn't fully processed the enormity of the situation. One day, she had been discussing the future of Tyler's community, and the next, she was overseeing the arrangement of their living space, making sure that Tyler's mother had everything she needed to start working as their chef. Tyler's father, in exchange for the shelter and opportunity they were providing, would work as David's driver. It felt like an odd, almost surreal arrangement, but Eliza knew it was the only way to make a real difference. Tyler had initially been hesitant, unsure of how to adapt to the luxury of his new surroundings. It wasn't just the mansion that intimidated him. It was the whole world that came with it. The lifestyle that Eliza and David led was foreign to him, a world so far removed from his own that he wasn't sure how to navigate it. But Eliza was patient with him, guiding him through the transition, ensuring that he knew he was welcome and that he belonged there. As Tyler settled into his new life, he began attending a private school that Eliza had arranged for him. It was a far cry from the overcrowded public school he had once attended, where resources were scarce, and the pressure to succeed was overwhelming. Now, he had the chance to focus on his studies, to learn without the constant distractions of poverty and violence. It felt like a dream to him, one he wasn't sure he deserved, but one he was willing to fight for. But despite the luxury that now surrounded them, there was an unspoken tension that lingered in the house. David, once proud of his accomplishments and his power, began to feel the first stirrings of resentment. At first, it had been subtle, a brief frown or a sigh when Tyler's family was mentioned. But over time, as Tyler's mother prepared gourmet meals for the family and his father drove David to important meetings, the resentment began to grow. David had always prided himself on his control, his ability to shape the world according to his vision. But now, with Tyler's family in their home, with Eliza's growing involvement in their lives, he felt like he was losing his grip on everything he had worked for. The charity, the generosity, the willingness to welcome a black family into their home, it all felt like a threat to his authority, his dominance. Eliza noticed the change in him. She saw the way he withdrew into himself, the way he avoided eye contact and made excuses to stay away from home. The man she had once admired seemed to be slipping away, replaced by someone she didn't recognize. She had hoped that David's decision to help Tyler's family would be the beginning of something better, a shift toward kindness and empathy. But instead, it seemed to be driving a wedge between them. David's resentment grew steadily, and Eliza couldn't ignore the growing distance between them. She had fought so hard for this, for Tyler and his family, but now she wondered if her actions were causing more harm than good. The mansion, once a symbol of their success, now felt like a gilded cage, a place where tensions simmered beneath the surface, threatening to explode at any moment. As Eliza looked out the window, she realized that the journey she had embarked on had only just begun. The road ahead was uncertain, and the challenges she faced were far from over. But she knew one thing for certain: she couldn't turn back now, not when there was so much at stake. The mansion was quiet that evening, the air thick with tension. Eliza had always enjoyed the serenity of the night, the way the city lights twinkled in the distance, offering a fleeting glimpse of peace amidst the chaos of her life. But tonight, a heavy silence hung in the air, an unsettling stillness that seemed to echo within the walls of their grand home. Eliza couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. It had been weeks since the Montgomery family had welcomed Tyler's family into their home, and despite the outward appearances of normalcy, Eliza could feel the growing distance between her and David. His resentment had deepened, and she couldn't ignore the coldness in his gaze. It wasn't just his pride that was hurt. It was something darker, something more dangerous. Eliza tried to maintain her optimism, focusing on the good she had done for Tyler and his family. Tyler had blossomed in his new environment, excelling in his studies and showing a level of promise that Eliza had never imagined. His mother, Celeste, had become a beloved figure in the kitchen, creating meals that delighted their guests, while his father, Gregory, had become a steady presence as David's driver. But no matter how much Eliza tried to convince herself that things were improving, there was a growing unease that she couldn't shake. David had become more withdrawn, his behavior erratic. He spent long hours in his study, often locking himself away from the rest of the family, and when he did emerge, he was distant, his interactions with Eliza and the others cold and dismissive. Eliza tried to reason with him, but every conversation ended in frustration. She couldn't understand what had happened to the man she once knew, the man who had been her partner, her equal. Now, it seemed as though he was slipping further and further away from her, consumed by something that she couldn't comprehend. What Eliza didn't know was that David had been plotting behind her back. His pride and desire for control had turned into something far more sinister, an obsession with regaining the power and wealth he had once commanded. His resentment toward Tyler and his family had festered, growing into a dark plan to rid himself of them once and for all. But it wasn't just them he wanted gone. It was Eliza as well. She had become a liability in his eyes, a symbol of the weakness he despised. If he could get rid of her and reclaim his power, he would stop at nothing to do so. David had been working in the shadows, making deals with corrupt associates, trying to find the right moment to strike. He knew that Eliza's pregnancy had become a symbol of their future together, and he couldn't allow it to interfere with his plans. If he could eliminate her and the child, it would create the perfect opportunity for him to reclaim control over the mansion and the empire he had built. It was a cold, calculated decision, and one that would change everything for everyone involved. The night that everything came crashing down began like any other. Eliza had just returned from a meeting with a local charity she had been working with, her mind occupied with plans for future projects to support Tyler's community. She had no idea that David had already put his plan into motion. The evening had started with a quiet dinner, a meal that Eliza had been looking forward to. Tyler and his family were there, of course, and the atmosphere was relatively calm, despite the underlying tension that still existed between them all. Eliza, eager to create a sense of normalcy, smiled as she passed the plates around the table, hoping that tonight would be different, that the growing rift between her and David could somehow be bridged. But as she took her seat, she noticed something odd about the wine she had poured for herself. It had a strange metallic taste, one that she couldn't quite place. At first, Eliza tried to dismiss it, assuming it was just the bitterness of a cheap bottle, but the sensation lingered and soon a dull ache spread through her chest. Her head spun, her vision blurred, and she found herself struggling to breathe. "David," she gasped, her voice shaky. "Something's wrong. I feel dizzy." David, who had been watching her closely, didn't react as she expected. There was no concern, no urgency. Instead, his expression remained cold, his eyes betraying nothing. Eliza's vision darkened, and before she knew it, the world around her went black. Eliza woke up to a nightmare. Her body felt weak, as though she had been drained of all her strength, and a dull, throbbing pain radiated from her abdomen. It took her a moment to process what had happened, but when the truth finally sank in, it hit her like a ton of bricks. She had lost her baby. She could hear voices around her, but everything felt muffled, distant. It wasn't until she opened her eyes fully that she saw the panic in Tyler's face. He was standing at her bedside, his expression a mixture of fear and disbelief. "Eliza, you're awake," Tyler whispered, his voice shaky. "What happened? You were poisoned." Eliza could barely process the words. Poisoned? How could this have happened? Her mind raced, but her body was too weak to keep up. She tried to sit up, but a sharp pain in her stomach sent her back down, tears welling in her eyes. The loss of her child, the child she had dreamed of raising with David, was overwhelming. Tyler's voice continued, but it was as if she could hear him from far away. "It wasn't just you, Eliza, it was all of us. Your husband, he's the one who did this." David's betrayal had been the ultimate blow, but it wasn't over. Tyler's father, Gregory, had been caught in the crossfire of David's plot. As he drove David to one of his meetings, the car had suddenly swerved out of control, crashing into a tree. It was no accident. Gregory had been forced into it, an unwitting pawn in David's game. He had been ordered to crash the car, a violent reminder that David was willing to sacrifice anything, even those closest to him, to maintain control. David had been severely injured in the crash, his body broken, but his mind still sharp. As the truth unraveled, the pieces of the puzzle came together, and it became clear to everyone that the man they had once trusted was a monster beneath the surface. David's desire for power and control had led him to this point. He had betrayed the woman who loved him, and he had hurt the people who had once called him a friend. Tyler's family, once hopeful for a better life, now realized the true nature of the man they had been living with. The mansion that had once felt like a symbol of their escape from poverty had become a prison, a place where their hopes and dreams had been shattered. The journey had come to a devastating end, and Eliza was left with nothing but the painful truth of her own betrayal. David's actions had broken more than just the family he had built. They had destroyed the fragile trust that had existed between them all. And as the walls closed in around him, David could only watch as everything he had worked for crumbled to dust. The air in the mansion was thick with uncertainty as Tyler, his mind racing, paced the floor of the guest room. His heart pounded in his chest, the weight of the truth pressing down on him like an unbearable burden. David had been behind the poisoning, and the car accident that had nearly cost his father his life had been no accident at all. The revelation had come to him in a flash. One moment, everything seemed normal, and the next, he was piecing together the fragments of a twisted plan that had been carefully hidden beneath layers of lies. Tyler couldn't keep this information to himself. He knew that Eliza had been devastated by the loss of her baby, and she had trusted David, trusted him with her life. But trust, as Tyler now understood, had been nothing but a mask for manipulation. David had orchestrated everything, from the poison that had made Eliza so ill to the crash that nearly took Gregory's life. And now, the truth had to come out. Tyler had spent the last few days gathering evidence, piecing together David's movements and his actions leading up to the disaster. It wasn't easy. David was careful, meticulous in his actions, but Tyler had been determined. He'd seen enough to know that Eliza needed to know what kind of man her husband truly was. As the days passed, the weight of his discovery had been almost too much to bear, but now, Tyler had made up his mind. He would confront David, expose him for what he truly was, and bring an end to the nightmare that had been unfolding right under their noses. The mansion loomed before Tyler as he approached, his heart racing. It was the place where he had once dreamed of a better life, a sanctuary for his family. But now it felt like a prison, a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. The thought of walking back into that house made him sick to his stomach, but he couldn't back down now. The truth had to come to light. Tyler entered the mansion with purpose, his steps echoing in the grand hall. He moved with quiet determination, his eyes scanning the familiar surroundings. As he approached the living room, he saw David sitting by the fire, a glass of wine in his hand, looking every bit the picture of wealth and power. The warmth of the flames danced on his face, but there was something cold about him, something that sent a chill down Tyler's spine. David looked up as Tyler entered, a small smirk playing at the corners of his lips. "What's this, Tyler?" David asked, his voice casual, as if he were unaware of the storm brewing. "You've come to join us for a drink." Tyler didn't hesitate. His eyes were cold, burning with the knowledge of what David had done. He took a step closer, and his voice was low, steady, but filled with an anger that was barely contained. "You poisoned Eliza," he said simply, the words hanging heavy in the air. "And you staged the accident that nearly killed my father." David's expression faltered for just a moment, his mask slipping, but it was enough for Tyler to see the truth. The guilt, the fear, it was all there, hidden beneath the surface. David's smile faded, and he placed the glass of wine down on the table beside him. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice tight. "You've got it all wrong." But Tyler wasn't fooled. He stepped forward, his voice growing stronger. "I know exactly what happened. You thought you could get away with it, didn't you? poisoning Eliza, trying to kill her and the baby. You've been planning this for weeks, all so you could regain control of everything. You've destroyed our lives, David." David's face reddened with anger, but he didn't speak. He stood up, the tension in the room thickening. Tyler could feel the weight of the moment, and he wasn't about to let David wriggle his way out of this. "I want you to prove it," Tyler said, his voice unwavering. "If there's nothing wrong with the wine, drink it. Drink it right now." David froze. His eyes darted to the glass of wine sitting innocently on the table. Tyler's words echoed in his ears, daring him to take the drink. The challenge was clear. If the wine was truly harmless, David had nothing to fear. But if there was any truth to what Tyler was saying, if David had poisoned it, this would be his moment to prove it. David hesitated, his gaze flickering between the glass and Tyler, who stood his ground, unwavering in his demand. The room felt colder as the seconds dragged on. Eliza had entered the room by now, her face pale, her eyes wide with confusion as she took in the scene before her. She couldn't understand what was happening, couldn't grasp the gravity of the situation. "David," she said softly, her voice trembling. "What's going on? What is Tyler saying?" David's hesitation only deepened, and Tyler could see the fear growing in his eyes. He had never seen David like this before, not this exposed, not this vulnerable. The powerful man who had once controlled everything was now cornered, caught in his own lies. Eliza's eyes shifted from David to Tyler, her expression changing from confusion to horror as the pieces fell into place. She stepped forward, her voice shaking with disbelief. "David, you did this." Her eyes filled with tears as she took a step back, as if physically distancing herself from the man she had once trusted with her life. David's face twisted in anger and frustration. "You have no idea what you're talking about," he snapped, his voice rising. "This is all a lie. I didn't do anything." But Eliza wasn't listening anymore. The truth had finally dawned on her, and with it came a painful realization that her entire life had been a lie. The man she had married, the father of her child, had betrayed her in the worst possible way. Tyler stepped forward, determined to end this nightmare. "Eliza, we can't let him get away with this. You deserve to know the truth. He's been poisoning you, manipulating everything." David's eyes flashed with rage, and he stepped forward to challenge Tyler. But before he could act, the sound of sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder as the police arrived. Tyler had called them earlier, knowing that David would try to escape the truth. Within minutes, the authorities had arrived, and David's carefully crafted world crumbled around him. The police took him into custody, his expression one of rage and defiance, but it was clear to everyone in the room that his reign of control had come to an end. Eliza collapsed into a chair, her face buried in her hands as the gravity of the situation fully settled over her. The pain of betrayal was almost too much to bear, and she couldn't even look at the man who had once been her partner. But amidst the heartache, there was a glimmer of hope. Tyler's family was freed from David's grasp, and they would never have to live in fear again. Eliza knew that her life had changed forever, but she also knew that she couldn't continue down this path of destruction. As David was taken away in handcuffs, Eliza made a decision. She would dedicate her life to charity, to helping those who had been oppressed and abandoned, just as Tyler had once been. She couldn't change the past, but she could use her wealth and influence to make a real difference. For Tyler, the road ahead would be difficult, but he was determined. Despite the pain of his past, he would continue to fight for a better future, one where his family could thrive, free from the shadows of betrayal,